I like to think of myself as a global citizen in more ways than one, even in terms of my heritage. My father's side of the family comes from northern India, Gujarat, and my mother's side of the family comes from southern Egypt. And the British brought our families and hundreds of thousands of others to East Africa to help lay the colonial railroads. And in one generation, my father's and his brothers, who come from a province, by the way, Gujarat, in India, that is known for two things, Mahatma Gandhi and entrepreneurialism. Okay, so they rose, past the working class ranks and owned a business. And at that time, we were all expelled from East Africa. We were not dark enough for the blacks, who were reclaiming Africa, and we were not white enough for the colonialists. We were expelled in 1972 by General Idi Amin Dada, and we wound up settling in Vancouver, Canada. And this is where I grew up, attending two types of schools: the regular, secular public school of most North American children, and then on top of that, every Saturday, for many, many hours at once, the Islamic religious school, known as the madrasa. And this is where I was regularly indoctrinated with two major messages. First, that women are inferior and cannot lead prayer. And even at the age of 7, I remember asking my madrasa teacher, why? How can this be? No, he said very sternly, no questions allowed, this is just the way it is. I remember saying to myself, my mother isn't inferior to any of the men around her. She is exemplifying leadership right now. I kept asking my questions, and my madrasa teacher stopped indoctrinating us about women and started indoctrinating us about another group of people, the Jews. The Jews, he told us, are treacherous and not to be trusted. The Jews, they worship mullah, not Allah, meaning money, not God. And he said, I have evidence for this. They are all consumed with business. Once again, I asked myself, really? I looked around my multicultural, multiracial neighborhood, and I noticed something fascinating. All of the new business signs being hung out were in Asian languages. Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Mandarin and Cantonese, so Chinese, Punjabi, Hindi, Urdu, not Hebrew, Urdu. And that's when it came to me that maybe the Jews are no more consumed with business than we Asians are. And you see, this was a moment of moral reckoning for me, because it was at this point that, though I wasn't able to articulate it this way, the sentiment I had was, what if I'm not being educated at the madrasa? What if I'm being brainwashed? Well, you know, the Quran, like all of the Holy Scriptures, is contradictory. It is not perfect. I'm a faithful Muslim in acknowledging that it is not perfect. Why do I say this? Well, for starters, it is a historical document. And my faculties of reason and my history degree from university tell me very clearly that the Quran is not divinely authored, but as a person of faith, I take the leap of faith to believe that is divinely inspired. Okay, this is an important distinction, because when you can make that distinction, then you can see that there are many reasons to ask questions, even of the Quran, or especially of the Quran. And I say especially because there is something quite beautiful about the Quran that I love to remind young Muslims about. The Quran contains 3 times as many verses calling on us to think and reflect and analyze than verses that tell us what is absolutely right or wrong. 3 times as many verses about thinking than about blindly submitting. The Quran says to men, for example, women are your fields. Go then into your fields and do as you please. Do as you please? Isn't this a recipe for unchecked power? Elsewhere, the Quran tells men that they can exert power over women, not with women, over women, because they spend money to maintain women. Now, that verse is not merely abstract or theoretical. It has made its way into a very problematic human rights charter that has been adopted by Muslim countries since 1990. It's called the Cairo Declaration. And there's a clause in the Cairo Declaration that says only husbands can provide for their families. Well, let's put two and two together. If the Quran says that by virtue of providing, you can control women, and this human rights charter says only husbands can provide, well, it doesn't take a PhD holder to realize that these are the religious underpinnings of a serious power imbalance. At the same time, the Quran contains many female-friendly verses. It gives women the right to reject marriage. This is revolutionary in a 7th century tribal context. And in some cases today, even in the 21st century, this is very radical. But my point is that misogynist interpretations of the Quran are not inevitable. Alternate interpretations, progressive interpretations are indeed possible. The Quran, contrary to what many progressive Muslims will tell you, actually does not denounce slavery. It tells masters that you should be merciful enough to release your slaves. And if your slaves ask you for release, even if they know that they can ask for release, you should provide them with that compassion. But it doesn't outright say, don't have slaves. And once again, this is not an abstruse question. You know, in the charter of Hamas, it is so interesting. They say that you should fight the oppression of Israel and even let your slaves go and fight Israel. So the great contradiction here is that as they speak of freedom from bondage, they acknowledge that within Islam you can have bondage of slaves. This is very revealing. There are ways, once again, of reinterpreting these passages for a brand new century and for a brand new era. And for those who say, Irshad, you know, you're just being too idealistic to think that this is possible. Well, this is exactly why I speak from within the faith. That there are even hadiths, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, where he made it clear, you know, that reinterpretation is important because what you are doing is paying tribute to God and to God's final authority in every single generation. If you are a practicing Muslim, if you're a devout Muslim, you believe in God, obviously. You believe in the authority of God. Only God knows fully the truth of anything, which is why here on this earth, we as human beings need to have enough humility to embrace our limited knowledge and therefore debate issues with each other rather than claiming that we have the monopoly on truth. And you know, only in a secular society can this happen. And this is why I say that to be a truly faithful Muslim, we must also be a secular Muslim. Currently, I'm building 2 schools in East Africa, my birthplace. Schools for girls, both Muslim and non-Muslim, in the spirit of critical thinking, of ijtihad, Islam's own tradition. So I've started a foundation called Project Ijtihad, whose goal is to build the world's most inclusive network of reform-minded Muslims and non-Muslim allies. Reform-minded Muslims lead the effort, and our non-Muslim allies, progressive allies, support us. And one of the ways that we're doing this is through digital technologies. You know, immediately after my book came out, en anglais, because of the burst of international publicity it received, my email inbox overflooded with messages from young Muslims in the Middle East asking me, when are you going to get the book translated into Arabic so we can share these ideas with our friends? I told them, come on, name one Arab publisher that would have the guts to translate a book like this, let alone circulate it. And to their credit, most of these young people wrote back to say, you're right, but so what? You get the book translated into Arabic. Then post that translation on your website and let us download it free of charge. They may be young, but they were smart. I took their advice. And in just over 1 year, we've had more than 300,000 downloads in Arabic alone. Now, some would say, yes, okay, maybe you're preaching to the converted. Here's how I know that that's not the case. A few months ago, I read an email from a New York Times Magazine reporter. She said that she had spent the last 6 months in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, researching a story about honor crimes. And she said that she's been interviewing many, many young Muslims about where are they finding the courage to finally speak up about honor killings. She said, Irshad, a lot of them have referred to your book, and some of them even come to my interviews with the Arabic downloaded book, in their bags. She said, here's why I'm telling you this. It's not to make you feel good, but it is to remind you that even though you get so much criticism from Muslims in the West, where your work really needs to make a difference, it is. So just keep that in mind the next time you receive a death threat. And I do receive death threats, mostly from Europe. Which is interesting because, again, we tend to assume that, it's from Pakistan, from Saudi Arabia, and Syria. And I get death threats from those places too. But these days, a disproportionate number comes from Western Europe. I refuse to live in fear. Refuse. I refuse to give the enemies of reason and humanity more power than they already claim. In Toronto, Canada, I started the very first program in the world exploring gay and lesbian people for commercial television, not for community television or not for profit television, but for commercial television. And actually this was around the year 2000, at the time when the technology, environment was still very robust. And so I managed to negotiate a very interesting deal with a major gay and lesbian website in San Francisco. They streamed episodes of my program on their site after it already aired in Toronto. So it was a pioneering effort in many, many ways. But I must tell you, I say this with a smile, but it wasn't so funny at the time, that this was also my first introduction to death threats. That prepared me to develop the spine, the backbone, to then withstand the death threats on a completely opposite, seemingly opposite issue, which is Muslim reform. I left that program, that gay and lesbian program, in August of 2001 to become the executive producer of a brand new channel focusing on spirituality. 2 days into my new job, 9/11 happens. And I have to make a choice about what to do. I wrote an essay for our major newspaper in Canada, and they titled it A Muslim Plea for Introspection, for Self-Criticism. It received so much response, positive, negative, everything in between, that various publishers approached me to turn that essay into my next book. And that was when I had to make the decision, would I give up this dream job, focusing on spirituality, executive producer, everything I've worked for? Or do I now devote my life to Muslim reform? And I knew it would be a lifelong effort, because you can't simply address this issue and then wash your hands and say, I'm on to the next challenge. No, this becomes your life's mission. Needless to say, I made the decision then to quit my job, write my book, do my documentary, and now work with young Muslims around the world to reform our own people. In essence, I am saying this, that Islam, far from being a religion of justice today, has become corrupted into an ideology of fear today. And it is we Muslims who have done most of the corrupting, and therefore only we Muslims who can fix the problem. And for anybody who says this is an un-Islamic or even anti-Islamic message, I speak as a faithful Muslim when I remind them that Islam's own holy scripture, the Quran, contains a beautiful passage about taking responsibility. It states, God does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. the most common question that has come to me through my website is from young Muslims, male and female, who have fallen in love with non-Muslims. Their parents and their imam insist Islam forbids you from marrying outside the faith. And these young people come to me in desperation. You can hear the desperation in their words. Irshad, is this true? Must I abandon the love of my life? So I decided to be strategic. I went to a progressive imam in America, asked him to exercise ijtihad, reinterpret the very verses that have traditionally been used to prevent interfaith marriage, particularly for Muslim women, and reinterpret those verses for a 21st century pluralistic world. He did exactly that. And he created a brief, concise, and very high impact declaration of why interfaith marriage is permissible from an Islamic perspective. I posted this interfaith marriage blessing, as I call it. I posted it on my website in English. It became such a popular download that I've now had to, by virtue of popular demand, had to translate it into 16 more languages. You know, the violent jihadis have been so expert, so adroit at using new media in order to spread their, oppressive message, their hateful message. We reform-minded Muslims have got to become at least equally expert at using digital technologies to launch a counter-offensive, our own counter-jihad. But jihad for what? Struggle for what? For ijtihad, for critical thinking.